Giselle Monroe walked into the fabrication yard with a thick envelope and a tailored gray suit already dusted from the gravel lot. She had not called ahead, she had not arranged a meeting. She simply stood in the open doorway of a steel-framed workshop, found the man she was looking for, and said it plainly. Her father had died 3 months ago. He had left behind a debt with this man that had never been settled, and she had come to pay it. Owen Hartley looked up from the workbench, oil still dark on his hands, and said nothing for a long moment. His expression was not grateful, not surprised. It was the face of someone who had waited 8 years for a sentence they already knew would arrive too late. What debt is heavy enough to outlast a man's entire life, and heavy enough that his daughter crosses a city to settle it herself? The answer is not a number, it never was. The morning had started the way every morning started at Hartley Fabrication, with the sound of metal on metal and the faint smell of heated steel drifting through the open bay doors of the workshop on the eastern edge of Cincinnati. Owen Hartley arrived before his crew, which was not unusual, and stood over a set of structural drawings spread across the work table near the far wall, marking measurements with a carpenter's pencil he kept tucked behind his ear. He was 34 years old and had run this shop for 6 of those years, building it from a rented corner of someone else's garage into a 4-man operation with its own property, its own contracts, and its own modest reputation for doing the work right the first time. The building was not impressive from the outside: corrugated siding, one wide roll-up door, a small office annex with a window that leaked cold air in December. But every contract hanging in the file drawer beside Owen's desk had been earned without a cosigner and without a phone call to anyone who owed him a favor. That was the point. That was always the point. His 4 employees arrived in order, filed through the side entrance, and started the day without ceremony. Owen was not a man who gave speeches before a shift or posted motivational words on the whiteboard above the parts inventory. He gave instructions clearly, demonstrated what he expected, and expected it to be done that way. His crew respected him in the quiet way that workers respect someone who does not ask them to do anything he would not do himself. He had poured the concrete floor of the annex office with his own hands. He had rewired the electrical panel when the inspector flagged it. He had welded the main gate himself on a Saturday when there was no one else available. The shop had his fingerprints on almost every surface, and that was not an accident. It was the only way he knew how to build something he could trust. Shortly after 7 in the morning, his phone rang, a number he did not recognize but with a Cincinnati area code. A woman introduced herself as Eleanor Voss, legal assistant to Monroe Structural Group, and told him that a representative of the company would be visiting the shop that afternoon regarding, as she put it, a matter related to the estate of Samuel Monroe. Owen listened without interrupting, said nothing when she finished, and ended the call. He set the phone face down on the work table and picked up his pencil and looked at the drawing in front of him for a long moment without seeing it. He was not surprised. He had not thought about Samuel Monroe in any deliberate way for several years, but the name arrived in his chest the way names sometimes do. Not as a memory but as a weight that had always been there, simply unnamed until now. He picked up the pencil and went back to work. Giselle Monroe arrived at 12:43 in the afternoon. She did not pull into the small parking area at the front of the building and wait for someone to come out. She pulled up alongside the open bay door, stepped out, and walked straight in, which told Owen something about her before she said a word. She was younger than he expected, late 20s, he guessed, with dark hair pulled back neatly and a gray jacket over a fitted white shirt, the kind of clothes that said she worked in an office but was not afraid of a room that did not. A woman in her 30s followed a step behind her, carrying a leather portfolio and already scanning the space the way someone does when they are preparing to take notes. Giselle stopped when she reached the center of the workshop floor and looked around once without apology, until her eyes landed on Owen. She walked to him directly. She said her name, she said her father's name. She held out the envelope and told him she was there because Samuel Monroe had died 3 months prior, and because among the documents he had left behind was a notation in his estate instructions acknowledging an unresolved financial obligation to Owen Hartley. She said the figure had been calculated based on deferred compensation records from the period in question, and that she was prepared to settle the matter in full on behalf of the estate. Owen took the envelope from her hand, opened it, and looked at the check inside. $240,000. He read the number twice, then set the envelope on the edge of the nearest workbench and looked at her. He did not raise his voice. He did not change expression. He said the amount was not enough. Giselle studied him with the measured patience of someone who had anticipated resistance, but not quite this variety of it. She asked him to explain what he meant. He said, "Come inside." The back office of Hartley Fabrication was a narrow room with a metal desk, two mismatched chairs, a corkboard covered in drawings and vendor contacts, and a filing cabinet that had been painted twice and still showed the original green underneath. Owen offered no apology for the space. He sat across from Giselle and Eleanor Voss, put his elbows on the desk and began to speak in the flat, unhurried tone of a man reciting something he has thought through many times but never expected to say aloud to an audience. 8 years ago, he told her, he was a senior structural design engineer at Monroe Structural Group. He was 34 on paper now, which made him 26 then. The youngest person at that level in the company's history, a fact Samuel Monroe had mentioned to him personally on 2 separate occasions as though it were a gift. He had spent 3 years at Monroe Structural developing a modular prefabricated steel framing system designed for residential construction, a system that reduced on-site build times significantly and cut material costs in a range that made it viable for affordable housing development. He had done this on company time with company tools, but the intellectual architecture of it was entirely his own, developed through nights and weekends and a level of technical obsession that his colleagues had teased him about more than once. At the time he completed the core design, Monroe Structural was in serious financial difficulty following a commercial project that had gone badly over budget. Samuel Monroe called him into his office alone one evening and made a proposal. The company needed to use the modular system as collateral for an emergency line of credit. The bank required a filed patent, and the patent had to be held by the company rather than an individual employee. Samuel asked Owen to allow the filing to proceed under the company name, with Owen listed as lead inventor. In exchange, Owen would receive full deferred compensation for the development work, plus a 20% ownership stake in the commercial licensing of the system once the company stabilized. Samuel Monroe said this to him in a room with no one else present, and Owen believed him, and so he agreed. There was no written contract beyond the original employment agreement, which said nothing specific about the arrangement they had just made. Owen trusted the man. He had worked for him for 3 years. He had never been given a reason not to. 6 months later, Monroe Structural secured the financing. The company pulled back from the edge. New contracts came in, the commercial projects resumed, and the modular system was licensed to 3 regional developers within the first 18 months. Owen noticed that his name had begun to disappear from internal presentations. The system was increasingly referred to by a product name rather than by its origin, but he assumed it was a branding decision and said nothing. Waiting for the conversation about the compensation agreement he expected Samuel to initiate. That conversation never came. Instead, on a Tuesday morning with no warning, he found a sealed letter on his desk. It was a termination notice. No cause was listed, no severance beyond the statutory minimum. His badge was deactivated by noon. He was told to leave his personal items with the front desk and that someone would have them couriered to him by the end of the week. Owen paused at that point in the telling and looked at his hands, which were folded on the desk in front of him. He had filed a civil claim against Monroe Structural Group 18 months after the termination, when he had saved enough from contract work to retain a lawyer for the initial filing. The claim ran for 2 years and ultimately failed. Not because the facts were wrong, but because the only evidence Owen had was his own account of a private conversation with a man who, by that point, was being advised by a skilled legal team. The patent filing, when he finally obtained a copy through the court process, listed 2 inventors, Samuel Monroe and Jason Caldwell. Owen's name was absent. He had not been told it would be absent. He had not agreed to its absence, but he could not prove the original arrangement without a document that did not exist. Giselle sat across from him and said nothing for a long time after he stopped speaking. She did not offer an objection. She did not offer a correction. She asked one question: did he have any evidence at all? Owen reached into the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and set a small brown leather notebook on the desk between them. He said it was not enough to win a case, but he said it might be enough to start one, if she was willing to look at what it contained. Giselle and Eleanor drove away from the shop in near silence. Eleanor said carefully that what they had heard could be the account of a man with a legitimate grievance, or it could be a sophisticated attempt to exploit the vulnerability of a company in transition following a founder's death. She said they should verify everything before taking any position. Giselle did not disagree with the logic. But she was thinking about the last months of her father's life, the weeks when the illness had progressed far enough that Samuel Monroe had stopped managing his sentences as carefully as he always had, and had said things she had filed away at the time as the disorientation of a sick man. He had mentioned once, on a Tuesday afternoon when the medication had made him slow and soft-spoken, that there was someone he had treated unjustly, and that when the time came and she was at the helm, She should try to find a way to make it right. She had held his hand and told him to rest. She had not asked who. She had not written it down. She was thinking about that now in a way that made the back of her throat feel tight. She told Eleanor to pull the full internal patent documentation on the modular system, every version, every iteration, going back to the original filing date. Eleanor sent the request to the company IT department before they reached the parking garage. That evening, Giselle returned to her office at Monroe Structural Group to find a notification that the requested file folder had been transferred to her workstation. She opened it. The folder was empty. Not corrupted, empty. The subfolders were present as labeled containers, but every document inside them had been removed. She sat at her desk and looked at the blank directory tree for a long moment, then closed the window and opened her calendar for the following morning. She was going to need to move carefully, and she was going to need to move without announcing where she was going. The next morning, before meeting anyone from the legal team, Giselle went directly to the accounting department and found Adrian Cole at his desk. Adrian was 41 and had been at Monroe Structural since before Giselle was in college. A thin, careful man who wore reading glasses on a chain and kept his files in a color-coded system that no one else fully understood. She told him she was conducting a routine review of deferred compensation records from the period 8 to 10 years prior and asked if the original ledgers from that time were still maintained in physical form. Adrian confirmed that they were. He retrieved a binder from a row of identical binders on a shelf behind his desk and walked her through the relevant entries without being asked. Within 15 minutes they had located it. A line item marked as a special technical consulting fee, the amount $240,000 recorded as a liability and noted as pending disbursement. The notation beside it was brief. It read, "Disbursement deferred per directive of CFO." The initials below it were JC. Giselle photographed the page and thanked Adrian without giving him more information than he needed. She left the accounting office and went back to her own and sat with the photograph for a while before she made her next call. She called Owen and asked him to meet her that evening at the shop after his crew had gone. He said he would be there. That evening she arrived at 6:30 to find him alone under the fluorescent lights of the back office, a cup of coffee going cold on the desk beside him. She showed him the photograph of the ledger entry. He looked at it without touching her phone, read it twice, then stood and walked to a shelf near the back wall where several heavy-duty storage cases were stacked. He took down the second from the bottom, opened it, and removed a small USB drive. He set it on the desk. He told her the drive contained the original design files for the modular system, every version, every saved iteration, with creation timestamps that predated the patent filing by more than 2 years. He acknowledged that digital metadata could be challenged by a skilled opposing attorney. What he needed was a person from inside the company who could confirm that his name had originally appeared in the filing documentation before it was removed. He said he believed there was one person who might be able to do that. Her name was Margaret Whitfield. She had served as Samuel Monroe's personal executive secretary for 15 years before retiring 3 years ago. She was 62 now and lived 20 minutes outside of Cincinnati in a house with a vegetable garden she tended carefully in the warmer months. Owen had found her contact information through a public directory after the civil case failed and had called her once, years ago. She had been polite and firm and had told him it was not something she could speak to. But that was then, and the circumstances had changed significantly. Giselle and Owen drove out to see her together the following Saturday morning. The drive took 23 minutes. They did not speak for the first half of it, and then Giselle asked him how he had kept the shop running through the 2 years of litigation. He told her he had worked nights doing contract welding and lived on about half of what the work brought in. She asked if he had had help. He said he had had Liam, his son, who had been born the year before the termination, and who had been reason enough to keep going on the mornings when going was harder than it should have been. She looked out the passenger window at the passing fields and said nothing for a moment. Then she asked how old Liam was now. Owen said he was 7. She nodded. They did not speak about it again. Margaret Whitfield answered the door in a cardigan and garden clogs and looked at the two of them standing on her front porch with the particular expression of someone who has been expecting a knock they hoped would not come. She let them in. She put coffee on. She asked what it was that had finally brought them to her doorstep together, which told Owen she had expected something like this, even if not in this form. Giselle placed the small leather notebook on the kitchen table, opened to a page near the middle where a series of dates and figures were written in Owen's hand, and where, in the margin, a small mark had been made in a different ink. It was a shorthand notation Owen recognized as Samuel Monroe's. a particular symbol the man used when he was informally acknowledging a point without making a formal record of it. Margaret looked at the mark for a long time without touching the notebook. Her expression changed in the way expressions change when something long held is finally given permission to surface. She took off her reading glasses and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. She told them that Samuel Monroe had spoken to her about Owen Hartley in the final weeks of his life. He had told her that he had become aware, sometime after the fact, that Jason Caldwell had added his own name to the patent filing without Owen's knowledge, and without Samuel's explicit authorization, that it had been presented to Samuel as an administrative necessity, and he had signed the updated filing without reading it carefully enough. By the time Samuel understood the full extent of what had been done, the civil case had already been decided. He had told Margaret that he did not know how to correct it without destroying the stability of the company and the livelihoods of everyone in it. He had told her that he was a coward about it, and that he knew that, and that it was the thing he was least proud of. Margaret then got up from the table and went to a cabinet in the hallway. She came back with a manila folder that had been stored inside a larger accordion file. Inside the folder was a photocopy of Owen Hartley's original, personal file from Monroe Structural Group, the file as it existed before the termination, which Margaret had copied for her own records on the day she was told to process the paperwork. Among the documents in that file was a single handwritten note in Samuel Monroe's hand, dated 8 years and 2 months prior, which described the verbal arrangement he had made with Owen in explicit terms, the deferred compensation, the ownership stake, and Owen's status as the primary inventor of the system. It was not a signed contract. It was not a legally executed document. But it was in Samuel Monroe's handwriting, and it named Owen Hartley, and it existed. On the drive back, Owen kept the folder on his lap and said very little. Giselle drove. When they were about 10 minutes from the shop, she asked him what he wanted to happen. He looked out the side window at the October light lying low across the fields. He said he did not want a public fight. He said he had spent 2 years trying to win a public fight and had lost everything in the process except the shop and his son, and he was not interested in repeating it. What he wanted was simple and very specific. He wanted his name on the thing he had built. He wanted the record corrected. And he wanted the company to stop benefiting from work he had done without acknowledging that the work was his. Giselle nodded slowly and said nothing else until they pulled into the lot beside the shop. Then she said, "Give me 3 days." She told him to sign nothing that came from Monroe Structural or from anyone acting on its behalf in that time. He said he understood. She said she needed him to trust her for 72 hours. He looked at her steadily and said that was a significant thing to ask from someone who had been given very specific reasons not to trust Monroe Structural Group. She held his gaze. She said she knew that. He got out of the car. Jason Caldwell found out about the visit to Margaret Whitfield through a source he did not name and did not need to name. He was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who understood leverage and timing, and he understood both well enough to recognize that the situation had shifted in a way that required immediate action. He went to Giselle's office the following Monday morning with a folder of his own and a practiced tone of concerned mentorship that he had used successfully on other people in other circumstances. He told her that Owen Hartley had attempted this kind of action before, unsuccessfully, and that the pattern she was observing was consistent with someone who had never accepted a legitimate legal outcome and was using a period of company vulnerability to try again. He placed his folder on her desk, a collection of documents that included internal communications, filing records, and board minutes, all of which appeared to support the official version of events. Giselle looked through them carefully. She noticed that the dates on 2 of the key documents did not align with the accounting entry Adrian Cole had shown her. She did not mention this. She thanked Jason for his concern and said she was handling the matter according to her father's estate instructions. He left her office with the measured satisfaction of a man who believed he had contained the situation. That same afternoon, Hartley Fabrication received a formal notice from a regional tax compliance office requesting a comprehensive audit of the company's financial records for the previous 4 years, with a response window of 72 hours. Owen called Giselle. His voice was even, but she heard the fatigue underneath it. He said he had expected something like this. She asked how much it would cost him to respond to the audit. He said it would cost him most of a week and the better part of his mental capacity at a time when he had a fabrication deadline in 4 days. She said that was exactly the intent. He said yes. She said she was sorry. He said it was not her apology to make. She said she was going to call the board into session for Thursday morning and that she needed him to hold on until then. He said he would manage it. She said she knew he would. The following morning, Giselle also discovered that the partner company which had placed Monroe Structural's largest single supply order that year had quietly redirected a separate contract, worth nearly $80,000, away from Hartley Fabrication to a competing shop. Eleanor confirmed after 2 phone calls that the redirection had been influenced by a procurement contact within Monroe Structural who reported to Jason Caldwell. Giselle wrote the name down in her notebook. She added it to the folder Eleanor was building. The night before the board meeting, Giselle worked until after midnight in her office. She was going through her father's personal files, not the official company records, but the cardboard boxes of notebooks and loose documents that had been moved from his home office to a storage room at Monroe Structural after his death. She opened boxes methodically until she found what she had begun to believe must exist somewhere. It was in the 3rd box near the bottom, inside a manila envelope that had never been sealed. It was a handwritten letter on plain paper written in Samuel Monroe's handwriting, addressed to Owen Hartley by name. The date in the upper corner was 3 months before Samuel's death. The letter was not long. Samuel wrote that he had learned, in the period after the civil case concluded, the full extent of what Jason Caldwell had done, that the name removal had been deliberate and unauthorized, that it had been presented to Samuel as a formatting correction, and he had initialed it without understanding what he was approving. Samuel wrote that by the time he understood the whole picture, Owen had lost the case and the legal window had closed. He wrote that he had wanted to reach out for years and had not found the courage to do so, and that he was ashamed of that. He said that the $240,000 in his estate instructions was the only concrete thing he could think to do from where he stood, and he knew it was insufficient, and he knew Owen would know it too. He ended the letter by saying he was sorry in a way that did not dress the words up or soften them with explanation. Giselle sat with the letter for a long time. Then she took a photograph of it, placed the original back in the envelope, and locked it in her desk drawer. She had what she needed. The Monroe Structural Board convened at 8 in the morning in the glass-walled conference room on the 4th floor. 6 members were present. Jason Caldwell took his customary seat to Giselle's right, his folder open in front of him, his expression composed. Giselle had asked Eleanor and Adrian Cole to be present in the corridor outside the room, available to be called in. She had also submitted a formal agenda item the evening before under the heading of Patent Attribution Review, which had generated 3 calls from board members asking what it pertained to. She had told each of them the same thing. She would explain in the meeting. She began without preamble. She presented the accounting record Adrian had located, the deferred payment flagged and held on Jason Caldwell's instruction. She presented Margaret Whitfield's photocopy of the original personnel file with Samuel Monroe's handwritten notation. She presented the letter Samuel had written to Owen, now photographed and printed. She presented the USB drive data alongside a written statement from an independent intellectual property consultant Eleanor had engaged 2 days prior, confirming that the file creation metadata was consistent with genuine pre-filing work and showed no indication of manipulation. And then she presented the final piece, a formal records request that Eleanor had submitted to the Federal Patent Registry, which had returned documentation showing that the original filing submitted 8 years ago had listed 3 inventors. The 3rd name had been removed in an amendment filed 6 months after the original, processed under a submission number that traced back to a filing agent acting on instructions from Monroe Structural's legal department. The name that had been removed was Owen Hartley. Jason Caldwell interrupted 3 times. Giselle did not stop. When she finished, she set the last document on the table, looked at the 6 members of the board, and said that she was not there to dismantle her father's legacy. She was there to finish the one thing he had wanted to finish and had not found the courage to complete. She said that the outstanding obligation was not $240,000. The outstanding obligation was 8 years of a man rebuilding from nothing what should never have been taken from him. She said correcting the record was not a legal risk. Failing to correct it, now that the documentation had been assembled and presented, was the only course of action that carried real exposure. Adrian Cole was called into the room and confirmed directly and without hesitation that the directive to defer the compensation payment had come from Jason Caldwell's office and had not originated with Samuel Monroe. The board went quiet for a long moment after that. Jason said with a voice that had lost its earlier steadiness that this was a selective reading of events designed to serve a predetermined conclusion. No one at the table looked at him when he said it. The board voted to place Jason Caldwell on administrative suspension, pending an independent investigation with immediate effect. They also authorized Giselle to proceed with a formal resolution of the Owen Hartley matter on whatever terms she determined to be appropriate and fair. The vote was 5-1, the single dissenting member citing the need for additional legal review, which was procedurally reasonable and ultimately did not change the outcome. Jason left the room without speaking further. Eleanor, standing in the corridor, watched him walk to the elevator and noted the time in her records. In the hallway outside the boardroom, Owen was waiting. He had not been present in the meeting. Giselle had not asked him to be because she had not wanted the board to read the situation as a personal confrontation. She had wanted it to be a governance matter, and she had presented it as one. Now she walked out and found him standing near a window at the far end of the corridor, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city. She walked to him. He turned. She told him it was done. He asked what that meant. She told him, briefly, what had been decided. He nodded slowly and looked back at the window for a moment. He said she had not needed to do any of this. She said she had needed to, very much. Not for his benefit, but for the record and for her father's, and because she did not intend to run a company built on something she could not look at clearly. 2 days later, Jason Caldwell leaked a story to a local financial publication suggesting that the new CEO of Monroe Structural was engaged in an improper personal relationship with a third party involved in an active dispute with the company. The story did not name Giselle explicitly but described her position and the situation precisely enough to be recognizable. A photograph accompanied it, taken from a public sidewalk outside the coffee shop where Giselle and Owen had met on their second meeting. Giselle saw it that evening when a board member forwarded it to her with a question mark. She called Eleanor, who had already traced the origin of the tip to an email sent from a Monroe Structural internal account. A violation of the company's confidentiality agreement that was clear, documentable, and not a matter of interpretation. Eleanor had screenshotted the metadata before the account could be scrubbed. Giselle organized a brief press briefing for the following morning. She did not approach it as a defense, she approached it as a disclosure. She gave a factual account of the patent situation, described the process of documentation and board review, and stated that Monroe Structural was in the process of correcting an attribution error that dated back 8 years. She was specific without being dramatic. She brought Eleanor and Adrian Cole, whose presence was not decorative. They were there as witnesses to a process that had been conducted properly. She did not mention Jason Caldwell by name. She did not need to. The response from the investors considering the bond issuance was more favorable than her communications team had projected. Several of the larger institutional contacts indicated that proactive transparency of this kind was preferable to the kind of disclosure that came out sideways later. Jason Caldwell was formally terminated within the week, following the confirmation of the email evidence and a review by outside counsel. The independent investigation into the patent filing irregularities was opened formally and referred to the appropriate regulatory body. Owen received a letter from Monroe Structural's legal team, drafted by Eleanor, notifying him that the company intended to pursue a formal correction of the patent record to restore his name as a listed inventor, and requesting his availability for the documentation process. Owen read the letter twice at the desk in his back office and set it down on top of the brown leather notebook, which he had not put away. He sat in the quiet of the shop after the crew had gone home, listening to the building settle in the cooling evening air. He had not let himself think about what winning would feel like, because for 8 years there had been no winning available to think about. He was not sure this was winning either. He knew that the word he was looking for was something closer to accurate. Things were being made accurate. That was different from winning, and in some ways it was better. The formal agreement between Owen Hartley and Monroe Structural Group was executed 3 weeks later, in the back office of Hartley Fabrication, with Eleanor Voss and Adrian Cole present as witnesses. The terms included the patent correction, a financial settlement that reflected the actual licensing revenue the system had generated over 8 years rather than the deferred salary figure from the original estate notation, and a 3-year supply agreement between Monroe Structural and Hartley Fabrication for fabricated components to be used in an expanded line of modular residential products. The supply agreement was not charity. Eleanor had reviewed the pricing independently and confirmed that Hartley's rates were competitive. It was a business decision that happened to repair something else at the same time. Giselle brought the documents to the shop herself. There were no photographers, there was no announcement. Owen signed where Eleanor indicated and then sat back in his chair. Giselle reached into the leather bag beside her and placed the original letter, her father's handwritten letter, still in its unsealed envelope, on the desk in front of him. She said her father had meant to send it and had not, and that whatever Owen chose to do with it was his decision. Owen picked it up, took the letter out, and read it again, though he had read the photograph of it twice already. He folded it along its original creases and put it in the inside pocket of his work jacket. He did not say anything about Samuel Monroe. He looked at her and said she had handled the situation better than the man who should have handled it 8 years ago. She said she had only done what should have been done from the beginning. He asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. They sat in the back office of Hartley Fabrication for almost an hour after Eleanor and Adrian Cole had said their goodbyes and left. They talked about things that had nothing to do with the agreement they had just signed, about Cincinnati, about the particular difficulty of inheriting a company built around someone else's personality, about the difference between understanding a business from the outside and understanding it from inside a room where the decisions actually get made. Owen told her that the modular system had always seemed to him like the kind of design that could be improved significantly with the right manufacturing partner, and described 2 specific modifications he had been thinking about for years that had never been implemented. She listened carefully, which he noticed. She asked questions that told him she had read more of the technical documentation than he had expected. It was the first conversation either of them had initiated that was not about the dispute, and it lasted long enough that the light outside the office window shifted from afternoon to early evening without either of them remarking on it. 3 months later, Cincinnati moved into autumn. Hartley Fabrication had grown. Owen had hired 4 additional employees, 2 welders and 2 structural technicians, to handle the volume the Monroe structural contract had added to the schedule. He had also taken on 2 other accounts that came in partly through the modest public attention the patent resolution had generated among regional developers looking for a fabricator with a specific kind of track record. He was looking at property for a larger facility. He had not committed to anything yet, but the map pinned to the wall of his office had 3 locations circled in red marker. Monroe Structural published a new product line that fall under a category it had not used before, titled Foundational Systems. The documentation listed Owen Hartley as the originating engineer of the modular framing technology that anchored the line. It was a single line in a technical brochure. It was also, for the first time in 8 years, accurate. Giselle accepted a regional business ethics recognition from an industry association that October. Her acceptance remarks were brief. She said that leadership was not always about building what had not yet existed. She said that sometimes leadership was about returning what had been taken, and about having the patience to distinguish between those 2 things when the difference was not comfortable. She did not name anyone. She did not need to. Owen heard the remarks secondhand through a colleague who had attended the event. He did not comment on them. That evening, he sat down to eat dinner with Liam, who was working on a drawing at the kitchen table with the focused intensity particular to 7-year-olds who have decided a thing matters. The boy looked up at his father and said he seemed different lately. Not in those exact words, because he was 7, but in the way children say what they mean before they learn to varnish it. Owen looked at him and said he had resolved something that had been unresolved for a long time, and that it had turned out to matter more than he had let himself believe. Liam considered this with the brief gravity of a child who does not fully understand but recognizes that the information is real. Then he went back to his drawing. There are debts that cannot be calculated on a spreadsheet and cannot be cleared with a bank transfer. They accumulate not in ledgers but in the years a person spends rebuilding what should never have required rebuilding, in the mornings they start before anyone else arrives, because the only thing keeping the walls up is their own willingness to keep putting 1 foot forward. When someone finally chooses to settle that kind of debt, not out of obligation or legal compulsion, but because the weight of carrying the untruth has become heavier than the cost of correcting it, what gets exchanged at that table is not money. It is the record. And the record, once made accurate, does not need to be defended anymore. It simply stands.